After her husband's mysterious death, Margaret discovers a dark secret about his past, which she can't believe. But with the help of his estranged best friend, she sets out to expose the truth, unaware that she is going near to her death. But before we start, if you guys like this story, please comment below and subscribe to Story Storer. Please hit the bell icon. Thank you. The cold wind cut through the cemetery, rattling the skeletal branches of oak trees and carrying with it the scent of damp earth. Margaret clutched the bouquet of white lilies tighter to her chest, her knuckles whitening against the dark wool of her coat. Tears blurred her vision, but she forced herself to focus on the headstone in front of her. The polished granite gleamed under the pale winter sun. James Whittaker. Beloved husband, loyal friend, forever remembered. The words stabbed at her heart as fresh grief bloomed. She knelt slowly, placing the flowers gently against the base of the grave. Her fingers traced the chiseled letters of his name, and a strangled sob escaped her lips. "Why did you have to leave me?" she whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air. "I wasn't ready to say goodbye." The sound of footsteps crunching on frost-bitten grass jolted her from her sorrow. She turned sharply, instinctively protective of this sacred moment. A tall figure in a long coat stood a few feet away, hesitant but resolute. "Margaret," he said, his voice low and familiar. Her breath hitched. "David?" James's best friend. She hadn't seen him since the funeral 6 months ago, when he'd offered her a stiff hug and vanished from her life without explanation. David's face was worn, older than she remembered. He stood a few feet away, shifting uncomfortably on the frozen ground. There was an unmistakable sorrow in his eyes, something he hadn't shown at the funeral. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said, voice soft but heavy with regret. I needed to be here today." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. It had been months since she'd last seen him. He had disappeared without a word after James's funeral, leaving her to grieve alone. The anger welled up inside her. "You disappeared," she said, voice shaking. "James would have wanted you to be there for me. For us." David's eyes dropped to the ground, guilt shadowing his features. "I know," he whispered, "and I'm sorry. But there's something you need to know, something I should have told you long ago." Margaret's heart raced. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "James wasn't the man you thought he was." Margaret's chest tightened. "Don't you dare!" she spat, her voice rising in anger. "James was a good man, the best man." David's gaze softened, and his hands clenched at his sides. "He was," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But he had secrets that involved me." Margaret shook her head, confusion swirling in her thoughts. "What are you talking about?" David hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "James and I, we weren't just business partners. We were involved in something else, something dangerous, something I should have never let him get tangled in." Margaret felt a shiver creep up her spine. She stepped back, unable to process his words. "Dangerous how?" David's face darkened. "We were working with a group that brokered illegal deals, things James wanted out of, but they wouldn't let him go. He didn't just die in an accident, Margaret." Her breath caught in her throat. "You're saying he was murdered?" David nodded, his jaw clenched tight. "Yes, and I couldn't stop it. I failed him." David's words hung in the cold air, heavy with the weight of guilt. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest as she struggled to absorb the revelation. "Murdered," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "James was murdered?" David nodded slowly, his eyes filled with pain. "I tried to protect him, but he was caught in something much deeper than I could handle." We weren't just business partners, Margaret. We worked with a group that brokered illegal deals. Drugs, arms, money laundering. The kind of things that can ruin lives and worse. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. James was involved in that? David's face twisted with remorse. Yes, he wanted out, but they wouldn't let him walk away. It wasn't just business, it was a trap. The kind of thing you can't escape from without consequences. He was trying to get away from them when he trailed off, eyes darkening. That's when they killed him. The ground beneath her seemed to shift, as if the very earth was swallowing her. Her hands trembled as she clenched them at her sides. So this wasn't an accident. David's gaze met hers, firm and determined. It was murder. Margaret's mind raced as David's words sank in. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, barely able to keep the fear out of her voice. David's face grew grim. "Because they're watching you. They know about you." Margaret's heart pounded as she and David sifted through the boxes in the attic, the dim light casting long shadows over old furniture and forgotten belongings. The air was thick with dust, and every creak of the wooden floorboards made Margaret's nerves jangle. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Are you sure this is where James hid it?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. David's eyes were fixed on the boxes. He was meticulous. He wouldn't have left it anywhere obvious. "It has to be here." Margaret's hands shook as she moved aside stacks of old papers and photo albums. She had no idea what she was looking for, but the urgency in David's voice drove her forward. Her breath caught when her fingers brushed against something hard. She pulled out a leather-bound book, its edges frayed with age. "This is it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The ledger, the key to everything. The ledger was heavier than Margaret expected, its leather cover worn but sturdy. As she opened it, she was struck by the careful neatness of the entries inside. Each page was filled with dates, names, and amounts, but none of it made sense to her at first. It wasn't until David began to translate the entries that the enormity of what James had been involved in hit her. "They were laundering money, but it goes deeper than that," David murmured, his finger tracing the lines of text. "These transactions are tied to illegal weapons, drug trafficking, and God knows what else." Margaret felt sick. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, had been part of a criminal network. A dangerous world she had no idea existed. The names listed in the ledger were not just random figures. They were the key players in a web of crime stretching far beyond what they could even imagine. "James was trying to get out," David said quietly, almost to himself. "But they wouldn't let him. He knew too much." Margaret's mind spun as the weight of the truth settled over her. She could feel the danger closing in, the possibility that they could be next. But she also knew they had no choice. This ledger was the only way to bring those responsible to justice. "We have to finish this," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. David nodded. "We will." For James' days passed in a blur as Margaret and David carefully planned their next steps. The ledger was their only weapon, but it was also a dangerous one. If they exposed it, they risked their lives, and James's death would never truly be avenged if they didn't act. Margaret felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her, but something inside her had hardened. She had to do this, for herself, for James. He deserved justice. "We can't wait any longer," Margaret said one night, looking at the ledger in her hands. The truth had shattered her world, but now it was the only thing that mattered. David met her gaze, his face lined with determination. "You're right, we move tonight." With the finality of their plan in place, Margaret felt a surge of purpose she hadn't known since James's death. No matter the risks, she was ready to face whatever came next. They had to take them down, or they would never be free.